Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to start this session. Although we are seeing only by now Douglas Cairns, Carmen, my colleague Carmen, and myself, the fact is that there are many other people, following the session. So our idea would be to make right now a very small presentation of the PhD course in which this session is inserted. Then I will pass the word to my colleague Carmen so that she can make a very quick presentation of Douglas Cairns. It's of course extremely well known. This would not be necessary, but let's say it's just for a question, not of being needed, but of necessity of a courtesy. And then of course we'll pass then the word to give the floor to Douglas Cairns, who will make his presentation. After his presentation, we will have an open discussion, so feel completely free to make questions, your comments by using the chat on your right side. Me and Carmen, we will pick up questions, and if we manage to, we will put them, we will share them on screen if it is possible. But if for some reason this is not possible, we'll of course read them, and so that everybody can follow and benefit from the comments that Douglas will make on them. So moving, directly to the issue or to the topic. So this is the closing session of the PhD seminar on classical studies that we have here at Coimbra University in Portugal. This course is directed by myself, Delphine Leão, and my colleague Carmen Soares. And so this is the final session of the PhD, and it is normal for us to invite scholars during the whole year, to start or during the process, and for the closure to invite well-known scholars to, of course, broaden the kind of contributions and the kind of people with whom students may be involved, and of course benefit from their teaching, from their approaches, and so on. So it's really a pleasure for us. It's a double pleasure for us to have Douglas with us, because he's a very good friend, and unfortunately he's not now in Coimbra. I hope that in the near future this will be possible, so that we can, of course, perhaps make this live, but having a different scenario, something more beautiful, or not only books and something of kind, but something more, connected to our local staging. And but besides being a very good friend, is of course an extremely well-known scholar, and so I really would like to thank him in the name of our two, and of course our colleagues here at Coimbra, for giving us the opportunity to listen to him. Douglas Cairns will speak about this topic, honor and the rhetoric of slavery in Herodotus. And I would immediately give the floor to Carmen Soares so that she can make a small presentation of Douglas' very big and extensive and very important career. Thank you very much to you all.
Thank you, Douglas, for accepting our invitation. I would like also to mention that this invitation is also an invitation from our Center of Research, our Center of Classical and Humanistic Research. So it is a pleasure to have you with us. And very briefly, because you don't need a very extensive presentation, I will say some words, and let's do it. Douglas Cairns works on ancient Greek society, ethics, and literature, especially the emotions. He has held the chair of classics in the University of Edinburgh since 2004, having previously taught in the universities of St. Andrews, Otago, Leeds, and Glasgow. He has held visiting positions in Italy, Pisa, Japan, Taiwan, and the United States. He was elected to membership of the Academia European in 2013, to a fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2018, and to a fellowship of the British Academy in the same year. He served as editor, the Journal of Hellenic Studies, and is currently chair of the Classical Association from the United Kingdom. I would like also to remember some of your recent collaborative research projects, starting by the last one, Honor in Classical Greece, 2018-2022, a European Research Council, and the one before that, History of Distributed Cognition, Emotion Through Time, from Antiquity to Byzantium, 2016-2018. Between your large publications, only a selection, A Cultural History of Emotions in Antiquity, edited in 2019, and Seneca's Tragic Passions, edited with Damian Nellis in 2017, and finally, but not the least, Sophocles' Antigone, London 2016. We are here to listen to your lecture, and you are very, very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carmen. Thank you very much, Delphine, for inviting me, and for all the students on the course for having me as the seminar leader today. It is a real pity that I can't be in Coimbra. It's one of my favourite places, as is the whole of Portugal, but Coimbra has a special place in my affections, not least for the ability to listen to the wonderful Coimbran fado after any academic activities that we might be involved in. So I look forward to coming back and to a glass of maybe Porto Tonico and some fado at some stage in the future. So today I'm going to talk, as Carmen has said, about honour and the rhetoric of slavery in Herodotus. So I'm going to focus on the presentation of the subjects of the Persian king, whether they're Persians themselves or subject peoples, as slaves, and on the presentation of Persian imperialism, especially the invasion of Xerxes' invasion of Greece, as an attempt to enslave free peoples. So these uses are metaphorical, because not all the Persians are literally slaves, and the members of subjugated nations don't become the property of the great king. So they're not literal slaves. But if the use of these metaphors is productive, and I think it is productive, then it will tell us something about the ideology behind these concepts. So the point is to ask, what are the implications of these metaphors for our understanding of the intersection of the ideologies of slavery and honour? Honour, as Carmen said, is the focus of our latest research project here in Edinburgh, funded by the European Research Council. I should also say that I'm going to focus on the way that Herodotus represents these issues in his narrative. So I'm not going to be talking about how these issues may or may not have been reflected in Persian society. And so what I'm interested in here is the ideological suppositions of Herodotus and Greeks, not Persian ideology. So this is all from a Greek perspective. So the issues that I want to explore arise conspicuously in a passage in the 7th book. This is number 1 on the handout. If you can all see the handout at this stage, excellent, that's great. So this is a passage in which we have a dialogue between the Persian general, Hydarnes, and 2 Spartan noblemen who are on their way to Susa to atone for the Spartans' earlier murder of Darius's heralds. So Hydarnes asks them why the Spartans refused to become the Persian king's friends, using the word philoi. And he gives himself as an example of the king's readiness to reward benefactors, or as he puts it, to honor good men, in section 135 there. But the Spartans point to the inequality of this friendship, what they would have to do, the way that they would have to show deference to get the king's esteem in return would in effect mean that they would have to exchange freedom for slavery. And according to them, slavery of this kind is the condition of all Persians, even Hydarnes himself. So Hydarnes advocates a relationship with the king in which the reciprocal exchange of benefits is a matter of mutual respect, mutual honor, as he represents it, while the Spartans, on the other hand, argue that the degree of asymmetry, the imbalance in this relationship, is tantamount to slavery. The imbalance is so extreme that the king is the master and his so-called friends are in fact his slaves. And this is a recurrent way in Herodotus of representing the relationship between the king and his subjects. So I've given you the references there at the end of section 1 on the handout. If we move on to section 2 on the handout, we see that the slavery of the king's subjects is also, as Herodotus and the characters in Herodotus represent it, the condition that the Persians are trying to impose on the Greeks in the Persian Wars. So Miltiades tells Callimachus before Marathon that the issue is precisely one of freedom versus slavery in Book 6, chapter 109. And Herodotus himself shows that he's supportive of Miltiades' stance by referring to the course that Miltiades is opposing here, the course of not engaging in battle, as the worse of the two views. So Herodotus supports this idea that the Greeks have to stand up for freedom versus slavery. In the same way, in connection with Xerxes' invasion, the historian himself endorses the view that the Athenians were the saviors of Greece, insofar as once they had opted for freedom, the rest of the Greeks, or at least the rest of the Greeks who hadn't already gone over to the Persian side, who hadn't already Medized, followed. That's 7.139. If Greek city-states had come under this kind of external control, of course, their internal political structures would have been affected too. The link that this presupposes between internal and external freedom is drawn most memorably in the dialogue between Xerxes and the deposed Spartan king Demaratus in Book 7, chapters 101 to 4. This is number 3 on the handout. So according to Demaratus here, what will make the Spartans resist the slavery that Xerxes is trying to impose upon them is the fact that although they're free, they subject themselves to the law. The law is their master. Their fear of the law is greater than the fear that Xerxes inspires in his subjects, despite Xerxes' belief that only that kind of fear is capable of making men fight. So internally, Greek communities are represented as different from the Persian Empire. A key element of this is that members of Greek communities freely choose their courses of action, by contrast with the obedience of the king's subjects, which has to be forced, it has to be coerced. In Greek communities, claims to respect have to be balanced by recognition of similar claims on the part of other members of the community. And failure to recognize claims of that sort is liable to sanction, including the sanction of other people's disesteem. Part of what makes the difference in this regard is what the Corinthian Socleas at 592 alpha point 1, there's number 4 on the handout, calls isokratia, the comparative equality between citizens that's characteristic of most forms of Greek political organization, with the exception of tyranny. So it's not just in democracies that you have isokratia, you have it in less democratic regimes too. But as Demaratus emphasizes, this is also a distinction between Greeks and Persians in terms of international relations. the freedom enjoyed by citizens in Greek states, at least when they are not under the rule of a tyrant, is in both the authorial voice in Herodotus and in character speech linked to the freedom and independence of Greek states. So internal freedom and external freedom are linked. These phenomena raise the issue of honor in a number of ways. First, we have the relations between the king and his benefactors. In opposition to Hydarne's construction, in number 1 on the handout, as we noticed, that these relations involve the king's honoring of his friends, his Spartan guests argue that this is a type of relationship that demeans the recipients of the king's benefactions. This is a loss of status, and the loss of status that this relationship involves is a price that they represent as being too high to pay. Then we have forms of political organization that demand a degree of respect for your fellow citizens, as opposed to the supposed Persian model in which subjects are coerced just like slaves. And finally, we have claims on the part of Greek states to freedom and independence that rest on these internal distributions of status and esteem. And again, that's in contrast to a model that sees the Persian king as the slave or the slave master, not only of individual subjects, but also of entire subject nations and communities. In all of this, the notion or the metaphor of slavery is being used to highlight extreme inequalities of honor. If the king's own subjects, the subject nations of the Persian Empire, and now at least potentially also Greek city-states and their citizens, are just slaves of the Persian king, then it might seem that all of these are being placed in a category in which claims to honor are minimal. If they're slaves, surely their claim to honor is minimal. But in order to establish the extent to which this is true, and to establish what Herodotus makes of it, we need to pin down precisely what kinds of honor we're dealing with here. So the Greek word for this concept I've been using of honor is time. And when it's applied to human beings, this word time, which is the regular Greek word for value or price, has two closely related and mutually implicated senses. It can refer to the esteem, the respect that a person receives from other people, but it can also refer to a quality or a set of qualities in an individual that attract the esteem or the respect of others. So it can refer to honor as esteem, but also to the claim to honor, which attracts esteem. It can refer also to the value that's esteemed by other people. So time is the value that you have, which is recognized by others, and it's also that recognition on the part of others itself. In the terms of the American sociologist Irving Goffman, time, like other related notions such as eidos, shame, respect, and hubris, outrage, is bidirectional. It encompasses aspects of what Goffman calls demeanor, how you present yourself, as well as deference, the way you respond to other people. Insofar as it refers to the claim to respect, the value that I have, that I want to see recognized, time also encompasses the roles that are bound up with a person's status. So regular meanings of the term, as I show in number 6 on the handout, include prerogative, status, or even office. So the timai, that were the offices of the Athenian state, both expressed the esteem in which the individual was held and constituted a claim to that esteem. According to Herodotus in Book 1, chapter 59, these timai, these offices, were left undisturbed by the tyrant Pisistratus. It's this sense of time as a claim to honor, as status, as prerogative or office that forms the biggest single category of applications of the term in Herodotus. Most of his instances refer to time in this subjective sense, the claim to the respect of other people. So time in this sense can refer to the prerogatives that come with membership of a citizen community. There's a reference there in Book 4 to the time of the citizens of Sparta. But it can also be used of the powers and prerogatives of gods and of kings. So the status of a god, the status of a king is their time. That's number 7 on the handout. And so for Xerxes, the position of king is itself a time. He says at the beginning of Book 7, Chapter 8, Alpha, "When I took the throne, I began to consider how to avoid falling short of those who preceded me in this time." So becoming king and being in this time are the same thing. The time of the king is a role that demands respect. But as we've seen, the king can be represented as someone who gives time as well as someone who receives it. And though Herodotus repeatedly returns to the idea that the relationship between the king and other people amounts to the same thing as the relationship between a master and his slaves, equally repeatedly, he also makes it clear that the same relationship involves reciprocity, reciprocity in giving and receiving time, honor. It's the prestigious status of the office of king itself that gives a king the power and the capacity to confer honor on other people, on trusted retainers, trusted servants. And he does this often by giving them special roles and special responsibilities. This is number 8 on the handout. So, for example, in Book 3, Chapter 34, serving as the wine pourer to Cambyses, described as itself no small time, honors a son in the same way as the role of messenger shows how Cambyses particularly esteemed etima malista, the father. These positions express the king's esteem as a reward for loyalty and services rendered. And this is often expressed as a matter of the subordinate's excellence, his arete, the idea that the subordinate has been a good man, as it's often put. But these positions also confer a prestige that others should recognize. Being the wine pourer of Cambyses is also a role that commands respect. So giving the role to the subordinate is an expression of respect from the king, but that role itself commands the respect of other people. And at the same time, the very services that these retainers and servants and benefactors perform recognize the king's claim to deference on the basis of his role, his office in the first place. So basically, the king honors his retainers and benefactors, and they honor him in return. Now, honoring benefactors, as we know, is normal Greek practice too, but Herodotus assures us at number 9 on the handout that it's also a Persian custom. So in number 9, as we see from a passage in Book 3, Zopyrus, a Persian nobleman, conceives the idea that Babylon is about to fall. It's going to happen. It's destined to happen. It's going to fall to the besieging Persians, and Zopyrus wants to be the one to bring it about, because he thinks that by doing this, he will obtain the gratitude of the king. And he recognizes that among the Persians, as Herodotus tells us, benefactions are greatly honored in return in proportion to their magnitude. So if you benefit the king, he benefits you to the same extent. To win the trust of the Babylonians, Zopyrus mutilates himself and blames the king, the Persian king Darius, for doing this. So he goes over to the Babylonians and says, look what the Persian king did to me, and he's mutilated himself horribly. Then, once he's inside the city, he opens the gates to the attacking Persians, and as a result, wins the undying esteem, the time, of Darius as Persia's greatest benefactor. That's Book 3, Chapter 160. In number 10 on the handout, we see the same thing in the case of Xerxes' gratitude towards Boges, the governor of Aeon in Thrace. This follows the same pattern. This is Book 7, Chapter 107. So we're told here that Xerxes never stopped praising Boges and honored his surviving sons because Boges preferred to die in carrying out his task as governor, sacrificing himself and his entire household, rather than be called a coward in the eyes of the king by surrendering the city and returning to Asia under a truce as he could have done. Number 11 on the handout gives us another paradigmatic instance. The gratitude of Darius towards Siloson, a Greek from Samos. When Darius was just a humble guardsman, he caught sight of Siloson on a visit to Egypt and took a fancy to his cloak. Although he offered to buy it, Siloson gave it to him as a gift. That's Book 3, Chapter 139. After Darius becomes king, Siloson seizes his opportunity and reminds Darius of his benefaction. And as Siloson had given according to his means in the past, now that Darius is king, he reciprocates in accordance with his new status. Chapter 140. So the king honors other people, subordinates, for their services, and these services indicate their arete, their excellence, their virtue. The exchange of goods and services can also bind king and subject into a relationship that's configured very much in terms of Greek philia, Greek friendship. And yet, as we remember, this is a kind of friendship, a kind of philia, that Greeks themselves describe as slavery. The interrelation, and perhaps we might say the tension between these categories, is brought out especially in another episode in Book 7. This is number 12 on the handout. As Xerxes and his forces are making their way through Phrygia, they are entertained by a rich Lydian called Pythias. And Pythias offers to devote all his money, an immense sum, because Pythias is the second richest man in the world after Xerxes. He's going to give all his money to finance the expedition. Xerxes says, oh, no. Xerxes won't hear of it. Instead, he rewards Pythias with the 7,000 gold staters he needs to bring his total up to 4 million, and he makes him his guest friend. This is Book 7, chapters 27 to 29. So Pythias thinks this is great, everything's going really well. He and Xerxes are friends, and confident on that basis, he asks Xerxes for one more favor. He asks Xerxes to spare the eldest of his 5 sons from participation in the expedition. And Xerxes is then furious. He's furious at the impudence of a slave. This is chapter 39 in Book 7. It's tolma, boldness, effrontery. It's anideia, it's shamelessness to ask for a favor of this sort, he says. Pythias is just a slave. But even though he's furious, he represents his punishment as a form of generosity. Just as he previously gave a greater reward than he had received as a benefaction, so now that Pythias has disappointed him, Xerxes will return less harm than he's received by only killing the son that Pythias had asked him to excuse. He has his men cut the boy in 2, and then he marches his army between the 2 halves of the body, one on either side of the road. Now, on the face of it, you might think that this story, like the story of Hydarnes and the Spartans, is designed to expose the misrecognition, the méconnaissance, as Bourdieu would call it, involved in the notion that the king and his benefactors can be philoi, friends, or xenoi, guest friends. You might think these stories show that the asymmetry is just too great, and the truth of the matter is exposed. Ultimately, you might say, Xerxes regards these people not as his friends, but only as his slaves. And yet, as we've seen, there are plenty of examples in which the norms of reciprocity are observed, benefactions are handsomely rewarded, and honours are granted from the king to his inferiors. These cases might suggest, by contrast, that the characterization of the relationship between king and subject in terms of the relationship between master and slave doesn't really apply. They're not really master and slave, they are something like friends. But both of those conclusions would be wrong, for the simple reason that in both literal and in metaphorical cases, masters can honor their slaves. Relations with slaves don't preclude honor or reciprocity. The coexistence of reciprocity of honor and extreme asymmetry of honor can be a feature of real relations between masters and slaves. I'll show this in a minute. And so it's not the case that episodes in which the king honors his subjects undercut the rhetoric or the metaphor of slavery. As Kostas Vlasopoulos has shown in a number of studies, of which I cite the most recent in number 13 on the handout, masters could and did honor their slaves for their services and their benefactions. As Vlasopoulos notes, slavery, this is a quotation, slavery could be envisaged as an asymmetrical relationship of benefaction and reward. Masters could opt to see slave labor as loyal service and choose to reward deserving slaves with trust, honor, and material benefits. Slaves could see their service as the foundation for claims to just rewards. And in this connection, it's important to notice that Xerxes doesn't, in fact, simply abandon the notion that Pythias is his guest friend, as if it were a fiction or a pretense. Instead, Xerxes insists that it's Pythias who's violated their relationship by failing to show him, Xerxes, the respect that he deserves. This legitimizes Xerxes' retaliation. But even so, he says, he won't reciprocate as harshly as the offense deserves. Now, what's going on here is that Xerxes originally saw Pythias's offer of finance for the expedition as a challenge. If he'd accepted it, he would have been in Pythias's debt. Instead of that, Xerxes creates a debt in the other direction so that Pythias owes him more than he owes Pythias. When Pythias then responds, not with deference, but with alleged disrespect, Xerxes again takes the upper hand. Pythias is still in his debt insofar as the loss, the punishment that he undergoes, is less than the loss that Xerxes undergoes as Xerxes represents it. Xerxes represents himself as being magnanimous in returning both the original benefit and in returning harm for harm. This is a way of maintaining the relationship of reciprocity, even as the description of that relationship in terms of slavery highlights its asymmetry. And in behaving in this way, Xerxes may be responding to the pool of what Herodotus tells us are Persian norms in the conduct of actual master-slave relations. This is number 14 on the handout. So we're told that not even the king, this is book 1, chapter 137, not even the king can execute a person for a single crime or a master impose any irremediable punishment on a slave for a single offense. Only after calculation, after logismos, that the slave's adikemata, his injustices, outweigh his services, should the master express his anger, his thumos. So there's a presupposition here that a slave would have grounds for complaint if these norms were violated. This would mean that the slave didn't deserve the treatment that he receives and was entitled to better treatment. By the same token, if these norms are widely observed, then the master will lose esteem if he fails to abide by them. Now, of course, whether we're imaginatively trying to put ourselves in the place of Herodotus's original Greek readers, or simply responding as modern readers to the story of Pythias, I think we're appalled at this travesty and perversion of the norms of reciprocity. As we know from the passage in number 15 on the handout, according to Herodotus, there are ways of responding even to genuine insults, genuine offences that are excessive and illegitimate. The case of feritime there in number 15 on the handout. But it's still important that Xerxes doesn't shrug off these norms, but instead justifies his conduct in the light of the norms. He represents his insane sensitivity to insult and the extremity of his retaliation as entirely consonant with the norms of reciprocity. Indeed, he represents himself as manifesting supererogatory forms of magnanimity. And this is a tactic that he deploys also in justifying what Herodotus represents as the attempt to enslave the Greeks. This is number 16 on the handout now. The attempt to enslave the Greeks, as Herodotus represents it, is driven by Xerxes' concern for his own time. Lots of references there. As we saw, Xerxes sees his position of king as itself a time. It's a role or an office that commands respect. But since his predecessors in this role, his predecessors in this time, increased the empire, as Xerxes sees it, the onus is on him to pursue further glory, to pursue kudos. At the same time, he also wants to get back the time that was lost when his father Darius was defeated by the Athenians at Marathon. He wants to obtain redress, which he calls timoria and tisis, both meaning redress, punishment, revenge, something like that. He wants redress from those who took the initiative, as he represents it, in unjust aggression. This is 7-8 alpha 2 to 7-8 beta 3. So here, Xerxes is insisting on royal time as a claim to respect. He regards that claim to have been illegitimately violated, and he justifies his retaliation as a response to an original offense. But his motives are also mixed, not just in the sense that the claim of justified retaliation coexists with expansionist motives. He wants more material goods and he wants more honor, not just that. Xerxes does see an imperative to maintain and enhance the esteem in which his office is held, as well as to defend what he sees as its legitimate claims. But insofar as he represents the expedition as a legitimate response to gratuitous harm, he's making a move that's typical in the rhetoric of warfare in Herodotus. And this is a key issue also for the historian, as we know. We know it primarily from his search for the original act of unprovoked aggression, the unjust deeds that began the hostility, the enmity between Greek and barbarian. These are the opening 5 chapters of the histories themselves in Book 1. This issue of who started it is, in Greek terms and in Herodotean terms, a matter of right and wrong, justice and injustice, number 17 on the handout. So this is a notion of justice that depends on strict ideas of reciprocity. In this scheme, injustice is what Marshall Salins calls negative reciprocity. In this case, it involves beginning harm rather than doing what reciprocity and justice would require and harming others only when they've harmed you first. Xerxes justifies his invasion as retaliation for dishonor that he's suffered, allegedly. But this is to acknowledge that if he didn't have such justification, the invasion itself would be an act of gratuitous harm, it would be an act of negative reciprocity. It would be an illegitimate attack on the honor of free and independent states. So even if Xerxes and the Persians regard other peoples as potential slaves, just there for the taking, they're also at least partially conscious of ethical norms that might present the enterprise of enslavement in a negative light. And yet, that enterprise isn't wholly moralized, even by the Persians themselves. Xerxes vows that the guilty and the innocent will alike bear the yoke of slavery, 7-8 Gamma. And Mardonius, his general, turns Xerxes' ethical justification for invasion into a simple a fortiori argument that blurs the distinction between provoked and unprovoked aggression at 7.9. He says it would be strange if the Persians were prepared to enslave peoples who'd done them no wrong and yet refrain from retaliating against the Greeks. The Persians want to enslave everybody, but they'll really want to enslave you if you harm them first. With these statements, the slavery of the Persian subjects emerges as a matter of might, of strength, of power, rather than right, something that violates the claim to honor of those who lose their freedom. Slavery dishonors, but slaves, both real and metaphorical, can also participate in reciprocal relations of mutual honor with their masters, even if the asymmetry of the relationship and its ultimate basis in power and violence remain to the fore. What the king demands from his subjects, and what he represents as having been violated by the Greeks, is what Stephen Darwall, number 18 on the handout, has called recognition respect. So what the king demands is that you respect his status as such just because he's the king. This is the status that Xerxes refers to as this time, the time that he assumed when he became king, when he took on the role or the office of the king in the first place. And Darwall writes in that article I've quoted there in number 18 on the handout, this is a quotation, that this kind of respect consists in giving appropriate consideration or recognition to some feature of its object in deliberating about what to do. In the king's case, this has no implications about his performance as king. It doesn't mean he's a good king or anything like that, but it does imply a claim on the king's part and a corresponding obligation on the part of the other person. The king's genuinely justified or allegedly justified retaliation is a move designed to force the others to show recognition respect. On the other hand, in seeking to increase his esteem as king, to be seen as a worthy successor to his father, to outdo his predecessors, to show that he's a real man and all these things, in all those respects, the king is focusing on a different kind of respect. The same sort of respect that the king himself shows towards loyal retainers and devoted subjects. And this is what Darwall calls appraisal respect. And appraisal respect responds to the excellencies, the good qualities of an individual. And Darwall writes, quotation again, that we may have appraisal respect for someone without having any particular conception of just what behavior from oneself would be required or appropriate by that person's having the features meriting such respect. But in fact, manifestations of time in Greek as appraisal respect regularly suggest that this qualification doesn't apply. One of the main areas of overlap in Greek context between recognition respect and appraisal respect is that agents typically feel that their excellencies demand respect and that withholding that respect is to violate a claim. So let's think of the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon in Iliad 1, for example. In that book, when Nestor, the wise advisor, intervenes in the quarrel, he demands that Achilles should show respect to Agamemnon just because he's a king. That's recognition respect. Achilles, on the other hand, says he's the best warrior. And that's something that Agamemnon has failed to acknowledge. That's appraisal respect, but Achilles represents it as a deficiency, as a failure, as an offense on Agamemnon's part to fail to show that respect. And so a slave in a household or a Persian subject regarded more or less metaphorically as the slave of the king may not only receive the master's or the king's appraisal respect, they may also feel that their merits, what's normally called their arete, or their being a good man in Herodotus, deserve such respect. But slaves, or subjects conceived of as slaves, can also command recognition respect. They can do this first because the role or office conferred by the master or the king as a mark of appraisal respect also constitutes a factor to which other people need to give appropriate consideration or recognition in deliberating about what to do. If the king makes you his wine pourer, then everyone else needs to respect you. Appraisal respect creates recognition respect. But also, this can happen. Slaves can command recognition respect also by virtue of the fact that to be a benefactor is to have a claim to reciprocity of respect. The king can make someone his friend as an expression of appraisal respect, but the continuation of the relationship between the king and his friend presupposes a degree of recognition respect, because your friends, your philoi, are not simply people that you evaluate positively. You've got to have some particular conception of just what behavior from oneself would be required or appropriate, as Darwell puts it. You can't treat your friends any old way. Your friends make claims upon you. The status of friend in itself demands respect in return for the respect that they pay you. And as Vlasopoulos has shown in particular with numerous examples, this is a feature of actual slavery in the Greek world. So Herodotus has taken that feature of the source domain of real-life slavery and mapped it onto the target domain of the king's relations with his subjects and benefactors as a metaphorical form of slavery. So the presentation of the Persian project as one of enslaving their subject nations, and the presentation of the relationship between king and subject as master and slave, tracks the ways, it follows the ways in which honor is implicated in actual master-slave relationships. To enslave someone is to deny them the recognition and respect to which free people are entitled. But performance of the duties of a slave not only creates extensive opportunities for appraisal respect, opportunities to be a good slave, it also leaves room, first of all, for the creation of roles that attract recognition respect, but it also leaves room for the formation of reciprocal relationships involving mutual exchange of recognition respect. And all of this is compatible, fully compatible with the idea that loss of freedom entails a catastrophic loss of claims to recognition respect, or diminution of claims to recognition respect. And it's also compatible with the idea that slavery as a status entails no claim to recognition respect in itself. You don't respect people because they're slaves. And this is an interesting point, number 19 on the handout, with reference to Aristotle. So Aristotle is wrong, clearly, about many things with regard to master-slave relations, in believing in natural slavery, for example. But he's onto something when he says that you can be the friend of a slave insofar as that person is a human being, but not insofar as that person is a slave. Master-slave is one relationship, friend-friend is another relationship, but the two can exist between the same two people. So it's not that the honor that friends accord each other here recognizes the status of human being as such. It recognizes instead the status of friend. But the point is that the honor that you might show a slave doesn't recognize the status of slave as such. And yet there are still other grounds on which human beings who are in fact slaves can nonetheless obtain honor. The fact that people who fill the role of slave have claims to honor on the grounds of services rendered, benefits conferred, and the expectations generated by repeated instances of reciprocity means that if you deny those claims, it's an illegitimate violation. And one way of describing such a violation would be to use the Greek term hubris. This wouldn't entail any implication that hubris is constituted on some form of honor that a slave possesses insofar as he's a slave. And no doubt also any such designation of such an act as hubris would focus to a large extent on the demeanor of the agent, the hubristes, as well as on lack of deference towards the victim. But the fact that even slaves can have claims to recognition respect, not insofar as they're slaves, but grounded in the obligations generated by concrete relationships and interactions, does mean that a description of an action as hubris against a slave needn't focus only on the honor of the agent, the honor of the hubristes. There's a way here, I think, to bring what my colleague Mirko Canevaro has recently published on this topic into a closer relationship with what Nick Fisher has argued in the past. This is number 20 on the handout. Now, this rhetoric of slavery in Herodotus serves two purposes. It characterizes the king's relations with his subjects, and it characterizes the project of imposing that status upon hitherto free, mainly Greek peoples. In both these spheres, the domestic as well as the foreign policy sphere, there are norms of reciprocity that the king recognizes at least to some extent. But in both those spheres, there are also episodes that highlight the extent to which the king feels himself, in pragmatic terms, comparatively unconstrained by obligations of recognition respect to real or metaphorical slaves. The hubris that this entails in Persian policy towards the Greeks, especially with regard to Xerxes' invasion of Greece, is of course extensively highlighted in Herodotus. That's number 21 on the handout. As Herodotus represents it, for representatives of Greek city-states, freedom isn't just a fact, it's a right. It's a status to which they have legitimate title. It's a claim to recognition respect. Free citizens of independent Greek polis resist Xerxes' denial of this claim to recognition respect, but they also castigate that denial as normatively unwarranted. Obviously, they don't want to be subjects of the Persians, but they also say it's wrong for them to be subjects of the Persians. It's wrong for the Persians to try to enslave them. And in a sense, the success of their resistance validates their claim. It shows that they are intrinsically free. But this isn't just a matter of the pragmatics of conflict. As Herodotus suggests, part of the Greek success derives from the legitimacy of their claim to respect. And several people, number 22 on the handout, have recently emphasized that this claim to respect is vindicated through the self-correcting mechanisms of a moralized universe, as well as by the interventions of gods, heroes, and human beings in upholding a universal order. So this is presented as the right order of things. And the mechanisms involved here, at least in a general sense, are, I think, interestingly law-like. There is a universal normative order, and Herodotus is confident that that order will be maintained. But still, the order is also maintained by the actions of individuals, human individuals and divine individuals, who intervene to punish transgressions of the normative order. So it sounds a bit, in very general terms, like Athenian law. There is a normative order, but in order to maintain it, individuals have to step in. So Xerxes' failure to accord free polis the recognition and respect that they deserve, his attempt to enslave these polis, these city-states, isn't just negatively characterized as hubris. That hubris is also punished. It doesn't escape without a countervailing redress. So that's what happens to Xerxes' attempt to enslave the free. What about his treatment of those who are already his slaves? And there I think the narrative of hubris and its punishment isn't quite so easy to construct and isn't quite so salient in the presentation of the histories. And yet, the excessiveness of Xerxes' attachment to his own honor, to his own time, is just as prominent in his relations with his existing subjects as it is in his relations with the Greeks. The treatment of Pythias, as we saw, is one example. But we shouldn't forget that the closing pages of the histories in Book 9, at the very end of the work, feature a very striking portrayal of a degenerate, power-crazed royal household divided by sexual intrigue, petty rivalries, and insane outbursts of anger. This is not the way to behave at home. In warning against forms of thinking big that can be described as hubris, in 21, A to C, especially A on the handout, 21A, Artabanus concentrates on the subjective dispositional aspects of Xerxes' motivation. He tells them, don't behave like this. Behaving like this has negative consequences. And of course, the histories conclude with a warning attributed to Cyrus the Great to the effect that the growth of wealth and the growth of power inevitably lead to decadence, decline, and becoming the slaves of other people, other nations. That's chapter 122 in Book 9, number 23 on the handout. The condition of servitude to a ruler or a conqueror and the power that imposes that condition of servitude are historically contingent. They're not fixed forever. The growth of power in itself brings with it risk. One of the symptoms of the growth of power and the growth of claims to recognition and to esteem is a tendency to forget the fact that even the powerful are vulnerable. Even the powerful are fallible. The powerful, above all, tend to concentrate more on themselves and their own claim to respect than they do on the claims of other people. That seems to be the case at home for the Persian king and abroad. In mapping the relationship of master and slave onto the way that he portrays ruler and subject, Herodotus reminds us that others have claims, even in the most asymmetrical of human relationships. Thank you very much.
Douglas, for this magnificent talk. I'm sure we have a lot of people, attending, and I would ask people or invite people, if you want to make comments, to ask questions. I'm sure that Doug would certainly like to listen to your thoughts and comment on them. And if I am allowed, maybe I could start with something. I thought all the concepts you presented were very clear, and in fact help us to organize very clearly not only Herodotus, the way he thinks, but also the way he organizes and sees the world, and this connection between a universal cosmos, but dependent or at least related to what happens at the individual. At the individual level, it's extremely interesting. In fact, well, just to start with a small question. When I was listening to the way you present, especially the connection between Xerxes and Pythias, and the way, in a certain way, this connection of philia was perverted or misunderstood by Pythias when he asked him to spare his son. I wonder if there may be some, let's say, if you think it would be acceptable comparison with the code or the behavior code that we can expect from the relation between Erastes and Eromenos. I mean by this that what can we expect from an Eromenos? Of course, he should not make the move or the first move. This is part of the Erastes. So in a certain way, Pythias was behaving like a bad Eromenos because he was, of course, receiving, signs of Time on the part of Xerxes, but he went too far, and in a sense, he was in a certain way inverting the position that we should expect. Do you think that is possible?
That's a good parallel. So it does help us think about relationships of philia that involve reciprocity, mutual exchange, that are nonetheless asymmetrical. So not all forms of philia are symmetrical. And there are expectations built into the asymmetries of certain forms that require, they require circumspection, don't they? So as you say, I mean, there are parameters within which the demand for a counter favor can be presented as legitimate or as normal, and beyond those limits, asking for too much can be presented as excessive. We see this in, I think, just about any example of that kind of relationship too, though. So the example of feritime, I think, which Herodotus in his own person actually condemns, is a good example. So in itself, in principle, in the abstract, because of what's happened to her son, retaliation is represented as legitimate. But the retaliation that she takes in its particular form is represented as excessive. Yeah. So it's not just a matter of whether it's a quid pro quo, it matters what kind of quid and what kind of quo it is. So it's not that there's an idea of strict commensurability, but there are intuitions about what balances what and what is legitimate to expect in exchange and what would be too much or too little in exchange.
Okay.
And of course, that's really difficult, is one of the reasons why philia as a relationship can be unstable and can be so fraught. Because as well as reciprocity, as well as exchange, there is the attempt to get the upper hand, the attempt to repay a benefit with a greater benefit that then puts the other person in your debt. So they then will try to respond in a way that will put you in their debt. And so it's never about exact commensurability. It's always about a very difficult judgment call about how much is going to be just right.
Okay, yeah. Are there other questions? I would be very pleased to keep continuing, but I would like to give the floor to other participants.
I would like to say that I am a very problem issues with my internet. I changed from the room at the center to my office here in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, but I'm hearing you very difficultly. So sorry I lost part of your discussion now. So I'm afraid.
Sorry about that.
But anyway, I think we have here our public and also our students. Thank you, Douglas, for all your discussion, and it was very, very stimulating for me as you discussed not only honor, but as you are discussing honor, you really approach topics that I do appreciate, and that is the question of hubris and all those kings and tyrants from Greece, all are portrayed as hubristai, and how we find this topic all along the histories of Herodotus. I don't know if you are listening to me well. I'm losing you anyway.
No, it's fine. We can hear you well, I think.
I think I have to change from room again, but it was only to thank you and to say that the topics you developed are very useful to our discussion, not only in the PhD, but also when we approach in other courses the history of Greece, ancient Greece, and the conflict between the Persians, and also the conflicts inside the Greek cities. So thank you very much. I have to change again from room. Sorry.
Right.
Well, perhaps can we continue a little bit further if it is okay with you, Doug?
Do we have any questions?
Well, not yet. I mean, apparently people are thanking a lot.
Hi.
That's everybody. Yes, Daniela?
Yes, I have a question. I'm sorry.
Oh, good.
So, Professor Douglas, you talked about how Xerxes felt that he needed to take the honor from the previous kings and continue that sense of honor, but also take back what his father lost when he lost to Greece. You also talked about some of the advices that he was given to them by other royal people, but what does Herodotus actually talks about when he completely lost his honor, right? When he loses again to Greece. So I guess that his losing was even worse because he was trying to take back what was lost. Am I making sense? So what Herodotus says about that specifically?
Well, that's a big question. So that's kind of a long history of Herodotean interpretation. So I don't really want to oversimplify it or to represent it in excessively crude terms. But it is one of the big issues. So there's a school of thought that what Darius does is in some ways different and represented differently by Herodotus from what Xerxes does. But in fact, there are lots and lots of similarities, as people have pointed out. So there are many parallels of all kinds of details. So even in the way that, for example, the crossing of rivers and natural boundaries is presented, portents that appear prior to the two expeditions and so on. I think it's less the case that what Darius does is presented neutrally and what Xerxes does is presented negatively than that some of the judgments are more explicit in the case of Xerxes' expedition than they are in the case of Darius's expedition. So my answer would be basically that as I think Herodotus is presenting the narrative, the invasion of Darius is itself also a violation of natural limits. And therefore, in attempting to obtain redress, recovery of honor, recovery of time, for the failure of that expedition, Xerxes is trying to do something that has failed once and should have failed, was right to fail, was destined to fail, because it involves uniting things that shouldn't be united. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess there's a belief there that there are, I think, both in concrete, geographical, but also in abstract conceptual terms, there are limits beyond which one shouldn't go. And both Xerxes and his father went beyond those limits. And so the attempt of Xerxes to compensate for his father's loss fails just as badly as his father did.
Thank you.
Know that Emmanuel, one of our PhD students, also wanted to ask a question. Perhaps, Daniela, can you put Emmanuel online? Okay.
So, hello. Thank you for presentation at first. So my question is about this Greek ideology that the Persians are slaves to their kings, and on the contrary, the Greeks are free, as they are equal, you know, as they have isokratia. But as you've mentioned, in less democratic Greek states, things don't work this way. You know, this isokratia is not in the same way that you have in fully democratic Greek states. So my question is, does Herodotus address this question that, you know, the less free Greeks are in some sense closer to the Persians than the other ones who are in fully democratic states?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of that. So some of the terminology, some of the characterization, some of the story patterns that you find with the Persian king are also found with Greek tyrants. In particular, the insane forms of anger and the incredible sensitivity to insult and dishonor is a characteristic that tyrants share with the Persians and with Eastern potentates as well. And this is not just a Herodotean thing, of course, but it's very pronounced in the histories. So it's not, as you rightly point out, it's not an absolute distinction between Greek and barbarian. There are of course, Greeks on the Persian side. There are Greeks that are not only less democratic than Athens, but there are Greeks that are ruled by sole rulers. So, yeah, I mean, some of the ideologies are complicated in international political terms, but I think in ethical terms, they're fairly consistent. So I think we get the very strong impression that Herodotus is against autocracy.
Okay, other comments if you want to? Carmen, would you like to? Carmen is back.
I'm back. I hope this time I can be with you. I'm not sure. So I have a comment or a question to you, Douglas. And it has to do with the parts where Herodotus mentions the hubris of those rulers against the environment, nature, diffusive. I think this topic is not exclusive from Herodotus, naturally. The context of the studies of the Hippocratics and so on also pay attention to environment. But when we approach this author and we have class of students that are very aware of the environment problems, I think this can be also a topic to explore with them. I don't know if you have more comments about this slavery of the environment that man can and he's doing. He has done all along our history, but nowadays it's very problematic. So
it's an interesting question. It would be a really good way to approach teaching Herodotus in class, I think. So I'm sure it would engage students at all levels. And there's lots of material for it. So there's potential for enlisting these themes in Herodotus, I think. I think it's doubly interesting because maybe there's something that's not always prominent in our own discussions about the environment in these terms that we can get a slightly different perspective on from Herodotus. And by that, I mean that I think Herodotus probably agrees with Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg and people like that there are ways of human beings overreaching themselves. There are ways in which human beings fail to know their limits, that they endanger not only themselves, but they endanger the whole ecosystem because of the failure to foresee the consequences of their actions. And that's fundamentally the kind of thing that Herodotus and the Greeks would describe in terms of hubris. So it's not knowing what the limits are to your own abilities, not knowing when to stop, not knowing what's up to you and what isn't up to you. So in all of that, there's a sense that human beings tend to go beyond their limits in seeing themselves as masters of everything. And I think there would be some common ground there between modern environmentalism and ancient Greek ethics, not just in Herodotus, but elsewhere. So think of Oedipus the king, for example. You know, he believes he's in charge, but the whole world, in fact, is very different from what he thinks it is. And there are lots of references there to the environment and its recalcitrance, the fact that you can't really control it. On the other hand, in thinking about these things, the Greeks, and I think we too, do tend to bring the environment within the purview of human concepts, sentiments, and social relations. So the environment in Herodotus that, if you like, strikes back, you know, when there are storms and that kind of thing, and the Persian fleet is affected, and there are meteorological signs that show that the universe, or the gods, however you want to call it, are on the Greek side, and all these various uncanny things that happen to suggest that the moralized universe is reasserting itself. It is very much a moralized universe. It's a universe that's seen in human terms. And it might be unpopular to say so, but I think there's an element of that also in quite a lot of our anxieties about the future of the planet. So what planet is it that we're concerned about? Is it the planet in which human beings have a role and human beings are in charge and human beings flourish and prosper? Or is it just the planet? Because after we're gone, if we're stupid enough to obliterate ourselves, and if the human race eventually dies out, then the planet will do really well. It will come back. I think there's an element of moralizing the universe in contemporary environmentalism, just as there is in ancient Greek notions of the universe and the cosmos.
Thank you, Doug. It was precisely what I wanted from your comments.
Thank you.
To put on the table how our classics are so inspiring and can help us to think about our present. So, and this question of environment and the resources we have, and that we have to preserve, and that are ways that nature tells us to be careful, and we don't pay enough attention. So I think so.
That's right. Yeah, for example, I've been collecting instances from the newspapers and the media in which the term hubris is applied to people's responses to the coronavirus pandemic, and there are lots and lots of them. It's almost impossible to keep up with the number of references to statements to the effect that this is a result of our hubris, our sense that we're in charge and that we can control things when in fact we can't.
Yes. Our background, classics of background ethics doesn't surprises us so much how things are going, because we have all those all that background. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's why I'm fairly pessimistic about human beings' abilities to turn any of these things around and really make enough of a difference to secure our own futures and our own advantage.
I don't know if we
saw the picture already. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe I've been reading too much ancient Greek.
Yeah. Or not. Yeah.
Oh, what's happened to Delphi? We lost him. I don't know. I see you. He get out, I think, accidentally. I suppose. Anyway, he's coming back.
Yeah. Okay. For some reason, I went out. I was not saying the right words. I imagine for some reason. So I was deprived of my teammate of being able to share the screen with you. So I became Atimos for a few seconds. We still have a few minutes for an additional question. In fact, if other people don't want to participate, we have around 20 people. Seeing us by now. Maybe I could be allowed a second question if it is okay with you. Okay. I find very interesting this comparison you made between, the way the world is perceived and the way the persons are presented, and this connection with the ethic law or the the Greek law and the Greek way of organizing law and the people. And you focus this on several occasions, but especially when you were discussing the time of a slave, which is a very interesting topic. Of course, you could expand this also to women and to children and so on, to those who in a story are not totally, integrated even in the Greek world. I mean, they are not perceived as fully equal as the others. But an interesting question about this is that how can we recognize hubris? Because hubris, if hubris really happens in a certain way, it's a way of recognizing the time that is being affected by this hubris. And you said that that's because we may affect a slave with hubris, not because that person is a slave, but because he's anthropos, is a human being. And my question would be this one: for me is let's say a topic that I've been trying to deal with for several times. It's the idea of, if you kill a slave, even in ethic law, this is an homicide. This can be the object of a dike fono, so it's a prosecution for homicide. It is not, at least directly, a prosecution for a damage to property, a dike blab, as we would say. So why does this happen? This means that because we recognize in the person of the slave, not simply an object, a property, but something more than this. Do you think that there may be, the concept behind this can be the same, the hubris and recognizing in the killing of a slave, a homicide, and not simply a loss of property? Do you think that
I think there's an element of that, to be sure. There are limited forms of redress open to slaves. So, first of all, they do complain about maltreatment. There are documents, letters, for example, where slaves complain that they have been punished for offences they didn't commit. And so they see themselves as potential victims of injustice, not necessarily in a legal sense, but at least in a moral sense. And I think you can never entirely rule that out. Slaves also have the right to petition to be sold to someone else if they believe they're being maltreated by their existing owner. But they're not accorded very much by way of actual rights in Athenian law. And of course, actual rights in Athenian law would be described by Athenians in terms of time. So time is the nearest thing that the Greeks come to a concept of rights, even though it isn't quite the same as our concept of rights. But if you have time, you have a claim and you have the right of redress if the claim is violated. So, as I was trying to say, slaves, I think, are not accorded the time of a slave, because the existence of a slave is, in a sense, the absence of time. But, clearly, on one level, people also know that these are human beings they've enslaved. So, also on one level, you're kind of at the crux of Hegel's master-slave paradox, that you're reducing this person to a status in which interaction is barely possible, and yet you're wanting this person to recognize you as a master, which they can only do if you recognize them as something in some sense too, in which you have some kind of relationship with them. And I think there must have been a huge mess about that in the pragmatics of daily life in the classical world, in classical Athens, say, that that there are real relationships with people who happen to be slaves, and yet there's a huge institutional and legal disability that's undeniable and always there in dealings that you might have with slaves. So I think it's really very complicated to sort out. As far as hubris against slaves is concerned, as you saw, I was trying to steer a kind of middle ground between Nick Fisher and Mirko Canevaro. So Nick thinks that if you can dishonor a slave, as hubris implies, if the ability to commit hubris against a slave is possible, then it suggests that you can dishonor a slave. So there must be some notion in which there's some residual sense of honor that even slaves possess. Maybe not qua slave, but qua something else, qua human being, qua a member of the household, something like that. And I've got some sympathy with that, but also I recognize Mirko's case that there's a lot to be said that the reason that the Athenian state wants to stamp out hubris against slaves is that it wants to stamp out hubris. And so hubris is a way in which one should not behave, regardless of who you commit it against. And so it's, to a large extent at least, about forms of conduct that are felt to be suitable for citizens and forms of conduct that fall below the level that's expected of a citizen. And I mean, clearly masters do believe they're better than slaves, but believing that you're better than a slave to the extent of the most extreme forms of diminution and derogation and insult, humiliation that might be imagined, might be the kind of thing that people think is going too far. It's forms of, it's a bit like, supposing you don't believe in animal rights, but you still believe that cruelty to animals is wrong. That would be a similar kind of situation. So some people believe we shouldn't be cruel to animals because they do have rights. Other people believe that whether or not we believe that, there are ways of behaving towards animals that show how awful we would be if we behaved that way, regardless of the rights of the animal, if you see what I mean. So there are agent-centered and act-centered and victim-centered ways of looking at it. And I think they're not necessarily entirely extractable and distinguishable in a classical context, a classical Athenian context. If that answers the question, I don't know.
Yes, it does, certainly. Thank you very much. Well, we are almost running out of time. Maybe, well, I would give the floor to Carmen perhaps to have a final word and to thank our guests for this great talk. I mean, not only the presentation, but the way you discuss it. We only miss here is, I mean, a glass of wine later on, and so that we could continue this with keep the symposium. But we will do it certainly, and I'm sure that many of people that are attending this presentation really share this feeling as well.
Thank you.
So Douglas, only a brief and last word of thanking in my personal name and the name of all our students and colleagues. It was a great pleasure to have you this time online, waiting for a real meeting live and in person. I hope we can do it wherever. Not make plans anyway. Thank you very much. It was a great lecture for us, and as usual, you give us the opportunity to think more about what we have been reading in a different way. So thank you very much.
Well, that's very kind of you both to say so. I really enjoyed the chance to see you, albeit remotely. I only wish we could go to a cappella this evening and listen to some fado and just relax and enjoy the sunshine of Coimbra. But soon, I hope.
Certainly. Well, thank you very much.
I look forward to that. Thanks very much.
And thank you very much, everybody, for having been. For the people who have been attending, and of course, do send us your comments if you want us to put you in contact with Douglas later. We are happy to do this, but especially enjoy the day, enjoy the weekend, and enjoy life as well, as has been shown, and philia as has been so clearly shown us by Douglas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye then.
Bye bye.